This is Devin with Writing Daily. We have a special guest today. But before we get into that, just for those who don't know, my name is Devin Galladay. I'm the editor-in-chief of In the Know Traveler, as well as the author of the forthcoming memoir, 10,000 Miles with My Dead Father's Ashes. And what I do pretty much every single day is we get together, we talk about writing. I bring in friends of mine, talented writers, to talk about writerly things. And today I have actually a friend, a talented writer, and actually one of the folks that was part of my writers group, sort of on and off, a fantastic talent named Seth Fischer. Seth, welcome. Good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So just to let people know, Seth Fischer's writing has appeared in Guernica, Best Sex Writing. Wow, how do you do that? Joyland, Gargoyle, and elsewhere. It has been listed as notable in the Best American Essays. He is an editor at The Nervous Breakdown and was the first Sunday editor at The Rumpus. Seth has earned fellowships and residencies from Lambda Literary, Gentile, UCross, and Woodstock Birdcliff. And he teaches at Antioch University, Los Angeles, UCLA Extension, and Writing Workshops, Los Angeles. He is finishing up a novel featuring both a goblin story and Hello, Dolly, and is also working on a memoir about what it's like to be raised by 4 child psychologists. Wow, that is an interesting topic. So, Seth, it's great to have you here. I'm really grateful. You're actually one of the first people that I wanted to get on the show because I think you are funny and smart, not to put the pressure on you to be either of those things now. And I thought we could talk about a whole slew of fun things. What's going on, Seth Fischer?
Man, not a whole lot. Speaking of fun things, I threw my back out yesterday. I'm approaching middle age and feeling that. It was a great time. I got to watch all of that new show, Cloak and Dagger. It really, brought out the best.
Yeah, middle age is a wonderful thing. I think I'm like on the cusp of not even like surpassing middle age. I think I'm, closing in on geriatricness, if that's even a word. So, okay, so there's a lot to discuss. So first off, I mean, we know each other from Antioch University. We also know each other from my writers group sitting in my living room. I have had the pleasure of reading your work sort of like before it gets published. I've had the pleasure of reading your work after it gets published, talking to you about editing. So how about we start there? You are a professional editor. You've edited lots of people's work, not only through submissions through websites, but sort of as a developmental editor. That's right?
That's right, yeah.
So when you see people's work, kind of what stage is it in? What is it in? And if you were to sort of have one kind of general comment for somebody who's preparing to work with an editor or start submitting it, do you have any special pearl of wisdom?
Sure. I mean, a lot of people don't know what a developmental editor is. That's usually the first question I get from people. And the easy answer to that is it's big picture editing. You're helping people look at structural issues, at plot issues, at major character issues. You're not fixing semicolons, although sometimes I do that as well. But if somebody is working on their draft of their novel or their memoir or whatever narrative-driven piece of writing they're working on, and they feel like they've gotten as far as they can with the knowledge that they have, and they're getting good feedback from their beta readers or their friends who are reading their work, and they just don't know how to get further. That is usually where a developmental editor comes in. So it's a little different than a creative writing workshop because our job is to suggest to you how to fix the bigger problems. And usually what ends up happening is the suggestions aren't quite taken, and we work together to come up with a plan to move forward. And it usually works pretty well. I work with two kinds of clients. I work with publishing houses, so that's a little different. So if your book has been accepted by a publishing house, but they think it still needs a little bit of work, which most do think that, they will sometimes match you with a developmental editor to work with you there. Or more and more often now, that's happening before the publishing house picks it up, just because publishing houses don't like to pay for things. They prefer to make the authors pay for it. and so now, I also often work with authors, but it should be pretty well along, and you should have done everything that you know how to make it better before it goes to a developmental editor.
Mm. So are there any particular, sort of general fixes when you talk about character development? Is there anything in particular that you sort of see routinely that is something that people should be mindful of?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of, so when people are first starting, I would say so often they start the book with somebody naked in a room not knowing where they are. Because that is what it feels like when you start to write a novel. And there are great books that have been written with that premise, but I would say that you should have worked through most of those questions. And a lot of people don't work through that before they come to an editor. Another thing that people frequently don't do is have their characters want something or have any stakes in the story. Often literary writers especially, they don't think about plot that much. And that can be okay. There's some great books out there without plot. But most developmental editors are usually looking for some sort of plot or structure. And that plot comes from people wanting things and people making decisions. And I can't tell you how many books I've read, beautifully written sentences, but nobody wants anything and nobody ever makes any decisions. And that can be hard to read. So
doesn't that start? I mean, I don't mean to be rough, but I am a little coarse. If the character doesn't want anything or care about anything, then why would the reader care?
That's exactly the problem. It also helps with the creation of tension if the character wants something. So, it's both why would the reader care for these people and, how is this creating tension?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are sort of crucial elements in driving plot and story and the whole kettle of fish. I mean, one of the things that I talk a lot about is being mindful of what's happening to your reader. Mm-hmm. In other words, why is your reading turning another page? Just because your character exists and we love our characters doesn't necessarily mean, and I think this is true of any form of writing, if there is absolutely nothing at stake for the reader to continue reading, like we may love our characters because we have some sort of an emotional investment in it. But if I'm picking up a book and I'm not emotionally invested in anything other than, I'll read a few pages and see what happens. Mm-hmm. If nothing happens that's going to inspire me, why do I want to keep doing it?
Exactly. It is about the reader. There's also a great Vonnegut quote, though, about this in his How to Write a Short Story. I don't know if you've ever read that, but I'm going to butcher exactly what he said. But the gist of it is, write for an audience of one. Don't write for everyone in the world, because if you try to make love to the world, you're going to end up getting pneumonia. I think that was the one. So you can't write for everybody, but you're right. You do need to keep the reader in mind. think that's important.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff. So how does that affect you as a writer? I mean, obviously, you look at a lot of people's works. You're probably fairly mindful of doing something for the reader. How does being an editor? I mean, does it make your job as a writer more challenging, knowing that you're just going to be reading somebody else's work in 10 minutes, or does it make it more challenging?
It does. I mean, I'd like to say no. I'd like to say that I can just, go write, and, and then edit and then write and then edit. But, sometimes it's nice to go for a jog or a hike. And sometimes I watch people who work outside, and I just envy them. Oh, you haven't looked at a screen in how long? And the truth of the matter is, though, that writing is, writing takes a lot more out of me than editing does. And I know I'm not the only one like that. And I think it's because you have to give so much more of yourself in writing, whereas in editing, there's a little bit more distance. I mean, I do give a lot of myself in my editing as well, but it's using a different part of my brain, right? And I think it takes a little bit less energy. So the way I tend to do it is I have a couple of days of the week that I dedicate to writing, and the rest is editing. So doing both in one day can be a little bit impossible.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think I would be challenged with it, but I agree with you. I think that even editing my own work was far easier than getting the initial stuff out, like the first draft kind of work, only because I think there was an automatic kind of vulnerability to what that means. Do you know what I mean? Because here's my idea. All right, now it's a real thing. It's uncomfortable. And editing always, whether I'm editing somebody else's work or my own, has a measure of detachment to it, which is kind of life-saving, especially when you're doing those first initial self-edits. You know what I mean? Like draft number 2 and 3 and 8 are easier. All right, so we have Hello Dolly, and we have goblins.
Yeah. So, the novel, which I just sent off to my editor, I'm proud to say, and I'm gleefully not thinking about for a month, in terms of editing it. It has changed a lot. It has changed. So as it has my elevator pitch, and this is something that happens to my clients a lot, and now I'm seeing it happen to me. So my initial idea of what this book was that it's a kid whose grandma leaves him a goblin novel she wrote when she dies. And it's the late 90s, the early days of the internet. And he goes and he starts putting it online bit by bit by bit. And people start acting it out bit by bit by bit. Until through this process, he, accidentally becomes kind of a quasi-domestic terrorist. Not because he has done anything, but because he just keeps putting this story online and he knows what's happening and he keeps doing it. And that, I really love that conceit. And someday I will be a good enough writer to pull that off. But what ended up happening was that's not what the story wanted to be. That's not what the story was exactly. And it also turns out that domestic terrorism is a very heavy topic to include in a book with goblin novels that's kind of on the YA side. So, so I'm working on the new sort of pitch about what it is. But in general, I think it's becoming a lot more about family. And it's called Coyote in the Blood. And the same premise is there a little bit, and there's still the goblin novel. But really what he's doing is he does put this online, and he meets some friends who start acting parts of it out, but then he ends up having to go back home and confront his family and his cousin, who is who's a neo-Nazi, and that's that's actually unfortunately a bit of an autobiographical part of it for me. And I think that's how it's going to end now. And I think it's much of a better book, but it's not as good of an elevator pitch, unfortunately.
So is it what you're doing now? Is it still more YA? Does it have a YA thing, or where's it heading in terms of audience?
Well, that's one of the things that I'm eager to hear back from my editor on, because it could be either. And I wrote a draft earlier that was definitely not YA. Very definitely not YA. But I've rewritten it to be more YA. And I think it is going in that direction. And that is not at all what I intended. But if I'm really honest with myself, the most joy I usually get out of reading comes from reading YA. Not always, but there's this like innocent joy that I get from reading YA that I don't get reading literary fiction. I love adult literary fiction, but you know what? I should do what I enjoy. Life's too short.
No, I'm in agreement with you. I remember years and years ago, I used to meet with this professor, a really smart guy, far smarter than I, and we would have these coffees. And basically what we would do is, I'm reading Jean Paul Sartre today. And we would have these very intellectual conversations about writing and literature and information. And one day I remember meeting him, and he threw Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone at me and said, "Oh my God, you have to read this." And he was at the time, I mean, this is years ago. I mean, he was probably, in his early 50s, said, "You need to read this," and had a cartoon cover. And it's, the silly cartoon cover that we are all familiar with. And of course, I eventually devoured them all. And as soon as my kid was born, started reading those to her.
Yeah, I mean, there's something about it, and there's a real power in them too. I mean, people think of them as not serious, but not to depress people, but I can't help thinking about what's happened politically in the last couple of years and how much people have drawn on Harry Potter for like advice on how to deal with this. Not that that's necessarily the best way, but just the fact that she had written a book that had done a lot to keep people opposed to the kind of things that are happening right now in politics. And it just blew my mind. I mean, nobody was talking about literary fiction. So many people were saying, "Oh, Voldemort, blah, blah, blah." So not that necessarily that was her goal or that was the best thing that could happen, but the fact is it did. And that leads me to believe there's real power there to change things.
No, I would agree with you. I think we're getting a little bit of feedback, so I apologize about that. But I think what was really interesting for me is I remember doing some reading and some writing about Salman Rushdie, and after he had a fatwa put on him, the book that he followed up with was Haroun and the Sea of Stories, which is a children's book.
Mm-hmm.
It's a children's book, and I think there's a measure of earnestness that we allow for children, but we don't necessarily allow for ourselves. You know what I mean? Like, I can get away with reading this children's book that has deeper messages, but it's still a children's book somehow.
Right, and I think you can be more overt in your messages as well in YA and in children's books. And I don't know if that's a good thing. That's bothered me ever since I've become a writer. And I think it might have a little bit more to do with kind of Gen X sensibilities, and this minimalism that came from, the Iowa School and Raymond Carver and all of that, where everything is supposed to just be bare bones and not thematic. And I see the reason for that, because oftentimes when people write from a thematic place, and I see this as an editor all the time, it does not work, because it ends up reading more like a screed than a story. And that's not what you want. But for YA, they figured out a way to have it be both a story and have morals, and that's expected and it's okay. And I think just right now in our world, I think we need that. And I hope that literary fiction starts listening to that more and doing that more, because I think they could do a lot with it if they weren't afraid of adverbs, and all of these other these other rules, which come from a good place. And as an editor, I can tell you, I understand why those rules are there, but I also think they're getting in our way in a really important way.
Well, just out of curiosity, I mean, I think kind of what's happening on the one hand, yes, we have all of these rules, and I mean, I think this comes from the advent of just MFA programs. You know what I mean? Like, here's how adults write, and it's not a bad or a good thing. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, my personal experience with MFA was that I got to have this great community.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I learned a ton, but I ended up with a really incredible community of remarkable people and writers. But at the same time, while over the last 10 years, we have sort of like the blogosphere is blown up. People who just write about whatever they feel like writing about in any way they feel like writing it. Do you see that happening in literary? I mean, I don't know if those two paths actually cross, but do you see any things where nobody follows any rules whatsoever?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a problem. It's funny, I was teaching a memoir class, and I just had my last class the other day, and there's students in this class who are publishing in places that, us literary memoirists would, dream of having that many people read our memoir and then get laughed out of the room. But they're writing a very different thing. They're basically writing, and I don't mean these students in particular, but I mean people who are writing for the more web-based stuff right now, have a lot more, it's a completely different set of rules. It's not about narrative, it's about driving a point home. And there might be a little narrative thrown in there, but it's all about driving a point home, which, is not necessarily a point that they believe in sometimes, but can also be a point that they just think will get the most clicks. And I don't know if I like that. I think it's taking away from a lot of the power that storytelling can have. That said, it's, I've written a couple of those myself. I've never had more people read things. So it's a toss-up, but I'd like us to get to a place where we can actually use narrative, the strengths of narrative, and the internet at the same time, if that makes sense, without getting sucked up by the hit farm machine.
It's a really odd thing, because I receive a lot of articles just for travel where people are doing that. In other words, they're presenting information that I don't think they're actually invested in at all. Mm-hmm. But they're hoping to just get a bunch of clicks by writing something that's either a little nasty, in the hopes that it will be compelling. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a drag. And I think sort of in this postmodern world of writing, it's more difficult, I believe, for the reader to have to sift through who has a genuine point or who has genuine passion for the things that they're writing. And I don't know what the answer is, other than we have to write about the things that matter to us.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. And, but it's also hard, because if you're a writer, you've got to make a living. And if that's the way you're trying to make a living, it's, the world is not very kind to us right now, if it ever has been. So,
Right. And I will say, just from knowing you as I have, I mean, you're one of the hardest working guys as a writer. Like, you teach, and you teach multiple places, and you do have all kinds of side gigs, and you're just doing it all. I want to say is it worth it? And we both know that of course it is.
mm-hmm.
Because this is who we are. It's what we need to do in order to accomplish stuff. I don't even know if I have a question in that. I was hoping I had a question, but I don't know if I do.
Well, one of the things I'm learning is it's worth it, but that doesn't mean I can't be smart about it. And I'm still learning how to be smart about it. So don't take my advice here. But for example, I was just talking to a student the other night about this, and she's really trying to push into the market of buying, of writing articles for places like Glamour that will pay her, and she's had some success doing this, but the pay is. And I don't know about Glamour in particular, so somebody can correct me there. But the pay for most of the places she's going to is not good. It's a couple hundred to maybe a couple thousand if you're lucky for an article that you've spent how much time on, and so it's not a really great way to make a living. And I was lucky enough recently to get hired to do copywriting for a hospital, right? My name's not on it. That's fine. I don't need my name to be on it because it pays like 30 times, right, what these places would pay. And if I can get gigs like that, which are not easy to get, I'm not saying all you have to do is go get them. But if you can find gigs like that, if you keep looking, you will over time find more and more gigs like that, which will open up your time to do the things that you really, really care about. And there's I think I'm probably stealing this from some self-help book that somebody told me about once that I didn't read, but I think it's a good piece of advice. Really don't worry about wrapping your ego up in the stuff that pays. Like, get as much money as you can so that you can spend more of your time doing what you really care about. I think that's good advice, as long as you're not working for Darth Vader or something.
Right. No, I would agree. I remember having lunch with a friend of mine who was, anyway, a writer for Rolling Stone and a freelancer for many years. And, he said in 1978, he was making $1 or $1.25 a word. And 35 years later, he was lucky if he could get $1 a word.
Right.
So, like nothing, in terms of freelance writing, which I think is actually really important, especially for people who are reporting on things like, major current events, politics, war, who are, putting their life and their safety on the line. And it's really hard because everybody used to pay $1 a word, and now nobody pays $1 a word.
Right.
It is and there's, the Huffington Post, which I've been published on many times, I've gotten exactly $0. But it does, there is, exposure is a word that gets bandied about a lot. I think there's a certain, it's not quite all that worth it unless you make a lifetime of just getting a lot of exposure, which that's what bloggers do. They get a lot of exposure, and then at some point there's a payoff, at least theoretically down the road. So anyway, let's kind of move more towards your personal writing. What was it like being raised by 4 child psychologists? That seems potentially very challenging.
Well, it's funny. I was well on my way to finishing this book 3-4 years ago. And sadly what happened is my dad got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. and I just couldn't work on it anymore. And I'm finally coming back to it now. I just wrote an essay about him and his struggles, and it kind of lifted this weight. And I feel like I can go back to it now. The short answer to your question is that it's weird, right? You know, and it's really hard to communicate rhetorically why it was so weird. It's not necessarily good, not necessarily bad, but it has shaped me in a way where I feel like I am living in a different universe than 90% of the people, just because of the way my brain works, because of the way I was raised. For example, here's a little story. So, you know, as I was going through my dad's books, we were cleaning out his office. He was an academic who studied child development. And I found a book that he was cited in. And then I saw that I was cited. Now, this book had been published in 1986, so I was 7 years old. And I go in there and I look, and there's this great, horrible write-up about how he was measuring my skull every week for the first, 20, 30 weeks of my life to see how my brain was developing, because that was the best way he knew how. You know, this is before they had all those rules about doing things like this. so he did that, and then there was 1 week where I got a cold and my brain stopped growing for a week. and so now I find this, and I'm sitting here thinking, if I hadn't gotten that cold, would I have accomplished everything I would have wanted in my life by now? Would everything? But also, it comes from this place where he really cared about me, but he was really doing something that's kind of messed up, right? That's just a weird thing to do to your baby. Maybe, I don't know. Some people might not think so, but it's that kind of thing. And I was trying to write about this in grad school, and I had a teacher once who wrote, your parents loved you. My mom hit me with a frying pan. And I'm just like, okay, well, my parents didn't hit me with a frying pan, but they also made me have to think about every emotion before I expressed it, things like that, that's not good for kids. So I'm working on it. I mean, there's a real sense of privilege I have by being raised by 4 child psychologists, and at the same time, a real sense that I've been having to relearn how the rest of the world works ever since then.
I think what is, and I remember your writing about this. I remember reading it, way back when. I think what's really important to understand, I think what you're doing is important from the standpoint is that you have a unique story. Mm-hmm. You have a unique story, and I think all of this stuff tends to boil down to certain sort of universal truths of what it means to be different and what it means to be sort of like just a human being trying to muddle through your life. I think that's why I wrote my memoir. Part of it is because I had a wacky, zany story, and part of it was, how do you kind of feel like the other, and how do you still love the people you're surrounded by and still have colossal issues? How do you work on these things? And I think what you're doing is important. How far along are you in now that you've been kind of returning to it? And by the way, I'm very sorry. I know about your father's illness. My wife's father is going through the same thing. It's hideous.
Yeah, it's such a horrible disease. I really hope that they find some sort of thing to make it a little bit less horrible soon. But your question is, where am I on this memoir? So I've gone back and looked through what I wrote before, and I don't think it's usable. It was great to write, very therapeutic for me, but I don't know how interested other people will be in reading it. I think that I have gone back and tried to.
Oh, we may have gotten you. You may have frozen up there, Seth, which would be a drag. But those kinds of things happen. By the way, if you like what we're doing, I'm hoping Seth, if he can hear this, will log back out and log back in. But if you like what we're doing, make sure that you hit the like button and all that kind of stuff. Seth, are you still with us? Yeah, if you can hear me, see if you can log back out and then log back in, and we'll see if we can run forward. Otherwise, we've already been doing this for a little while. So, you almost crept back in, and I'm starting to freeze up myself. So, we might be having some caching issues. Those kinds of things aren't unheard of when you are doing remote relays and conversations as we are. So, I think since I'm not seeing you change in terms of your video feed, then I think probably what I'll do is I will say, so Seth, thank you so much. Oh, are you there now?
I am back. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, no, I can now. I think you were just, you were telling us a story about, I switched gears. I wasn't sure if we were going to get you back in time. But the story about, where you are in terms of your writing on your own memoir, is that something that's continuing?
Yes, it's definitely continuing. I'm in the middle of writing a book proposal for it right now. So that's where I am. That's where I am, trying to figure out how to restructure it in a way that I'm happier with it. Fantastic.
Any final thoughts?
I just thank you so much for having me on here. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I wish you all the best with your book. I've been reading your book for years and years and years in our writing group. I've been rooting for it forever, and I'm so happy it's going to be in the world. And go pre-order 30 copies, everyone. It's really a good one. You'll be happy to give it away as gifts or whatever, and to support Devin, who deserves a lot of support.
Seth, I am absolutely grateful that you're here. And if people want to find out more about you, your writing, read your work, where can they check you out? Where can they find you?
So I'm at seth-fischer.com, and Fischer has a C in it. That's very important, or you get, I think, a Christian wrestler in Wyoming.
So that's Fischer?
Correct.
And Seth
Fischer.
All right, perfect. That's what we wanted. And do you have anything special coming up that we should know about?
I have a reading coming up in August at the Last Bookstore, and that will be shortly posted on my website. And for right now, that's pretty much it. I have a few more readings. There's a Lambda Lit Fest. If you're in LA and you're into LGBTQ issues, there's a Lambda Lit Fest coming up in the fall. And so keep your eyes out for that, because there are going to be so many great writers coming through town, you won't even know what hit you.
Dude, that sounds incredible. Again, Seth, thank you so much for being here. And if you like what we're doing, please make sure that you consider hitting the like button, share this to your friends, and of course, go to Seth-Fischer with a C.com to see what Seth is up to, find out more about his work, where he's going to be appearing, all that kind of great stuff. And that's what we've got for today. So as always, writing daily is a daily practice. So if you are working on your stuff, keep doing it little by little. Join us here. And remember, subscribe to me on iTunes, find me on Facebook, YouTube. I'm kind of all over the place at this stage. And again, I'm going to be doing this in the very, very near future, maybe even tomorrow. And we're going to talk about more important things for writers to know. Seth, thank you again. And we will talk to you guys again real soon. Thanks.